I'm Derek Wheatley, and welcome to episode 222, all the twos today, of the Wheatley podcast. Thank you very much for joining us, of course. If you would, I'd like to put this in at the start of every episode now. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, because, of course, that helps with the whole algorithm and all that kind of stuff. Thank you very much for listening to me last week talk about masterpieces and the idea of creativity and how we, if we can do it, we should be doing it in all kind of manners. And I've kind of made myself do it now because I put it out there, but I'm going to be making an album and kind of doing something like that. So I'm looking forward to it. But this week's episode, our guest is a lecturer of modern Irish at UCC, and his name is Aidan Doyle. How are you doing, Aidan?
Hi, good to see you.
Lovely to see you. Lovely to have you on, of course. We were kind of talking just before about, looking at different screens and stuff. I just want to put this out there, so not just for you, Aidan, but for everybody watching. I was doing some training today, and when you get like, it's not like a really bad injury or something, but you get this really small spot in your back, and it's like a little niggle or something that you're not quite sure how it happened. So if I'm shifting around in my chair, that is essentially what that is. It's nothing else. So I'm not getting agitated or bored or anything like that. So everybody knows it's out there. But Aidan, we always start at the beginning. Could you give us a short history of your upbringing, please?
I grew up in Cork City in the 1960s, 1970s. In a housing estate, a 1960s housing estate at the edge of the city, as it was. Cork City was much smaller then.
Mm.
We were right beside the country, actually. I remember that was maybe it's one of the big changes I've seen in it. You were very aware of the presence of the country in a way that's not there anymore, and there was a big difference between city and country, which has disappeared from Ireland in my lifetime. Somebody said everything everywhere in Ireland is now suburban. There's a certain truth to that, I think, whether it's the Tory Island or the Aran Islands, and or the heart of Dublin.
Yeah.
And I went to state, the usual state schools. No family background with Irish or anything like that. People often ask me, "Oh, did you grow up speaking Irish, or were your parents?" I wouldn't say the opposite. My father's from Dublin, and he would have had education through Irish because he grew up in the 1930s, 1940s, and there was a very, very strong Irish language policy in education. And so he'd have done sums and history and stuff like that through Irish. He needs to remember bits of Irish. So but funnily enough, he was not particularly against Irish. My mother was from the west of Ireland. So she'd have been, if you like, closer to that, to parts of Ireland that had been Irish speaking until recently, and she had the kind of, I would say, the typical prejudice of a lot of people against Irish. It's no good, and why would you want to be studying that thing for? Even though the way she spoke English actually was quite close to the way people spoke Irish. So so that's just by way of family background regarding of what I ended up doing. There was nothing there to it, and in fact the school I went to it was rugby playing.
Right.
I used to joke that you got double points for rugby at my school, and it was certainly not just Irish, but languages in general were kind of regarded as, okay, we have to do this, but we're not really interested. It was very much maths, physics, accountancy, stuff like that, I think I don't know anybody else hardly from my school who studied languages, So there was nothing really, I suppose, to predict that I'd to follow the career path that I did.
Yeah, it's kind of the well, not quite the first question, but the idea that I would have in my head. Now I don't speak Irish, but if I think of yourself in the position that you're in, obviously I immediately think, well, Aidan must have been speaking Irish at home, and he must have been speaking. It's just the obvious conclusions that you come to.
And it often is true. Right?
Yeah,
there are
of course.
people who got that from their families and then followed on with it themselves, but not in my case. No, it was. Sorry, go on.
No. Because obviously we're gonna get into why you eventually got to where you are now. But we always ask as well, in important to the podcast, when you first became aware of mental health.
Gosh, probably when I was an adult, I'd imagine. It was, I don't remember it being talked about at school, in society in general. Very, very, I would say, it's hard for me to put it. I would have said not before the 1980s, maybe.
Yeah.
And then, there would, like, through broadcasting stuff like newspaper, there was a kind of I think a gradual growing awareness of it. But I'd have been an adult by the time, definitely. It
Yeah.
it wouldn't have figured. I mean, of course, there was a dim awareness that, some people suffered, but
Yeah.
it just wasn't, as you probably know, it wasn't talked about, So,
Yeah, and
yeah.
I think that's what's been, and I mentioned this a few times, like that's what's been kind of so interesting about this question in particular, because it seems to be a generational kind of divide with regards to when people have heard. And, when we have people on that maybe are in their 20s and they talk about it, it's like they heard about it in school,
Yeah.
but through an education, through the education system rather than like, the old idea of someone suffers with their nerves and that kind
That
of
would have
idea.
been my
Yeah.
experience. There was just this kind of catch-all phrase, really, and
It's a
it
bit,
covered
yeah.
probably a whole range of
Yeah.
conditions that just there was I would have said there was a certain awkwardness about it. There would have been,
Yeah.
like, for families, there would have been shame. You didn't talk if there was somebody, let's say, who was suffering. People didn't want to talk about it that much. I
Yeah,
think with
I
some of the
know.
stuff. Yeah,
I agree.
yeah.
Yeah. So, how did you end up studying for a PhD in linguistics in Poland?
Okay, like a lot of stuff in life, it's I mean, I think some people have different philosophies about
Hmm.
our lives, and some people say, that we can shape our lives. I think that's very much, I would say, maybe modern philosophy. You were
Yeah.
responsible. You could do whatever you want. You could be whoever you want. You could be the president of the US, or you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I
And
did.
I suppose I think I would, if I look back now in my own life, I would say an awful lot of it is just out to chance. You
Yeah.
think you're shaping things, but I studied Irish, and I got a temporary job back in the 1980s in UCD, but it wasn't going to last. And I kind of was at a loose end. I mean, I wasn't quite sure exactly where I wanted to go or what I wanted to do with my, that kind of way. And I was walking down the corridor one day, and I met somebody, and he said, "Have you ever thought of going to Poland?" And I said, "Not really. No, wouldn't have been high up on my list of things to do." And he said, "Well, there's somebody there. There's somebody in Dublin at the moment who's looking for somebody to go back to Poland to teach Irish."
Right.
And I just kind of said, sure, I'll go down and see what they want. And it was as casual, as unintentional as that. And then, I mean, a lot of people, when I told them, thought, first of all, they thought I was making it up. And
Mm.
then, speaking of mental health, they probably thought that I needed, there was something,
Yeah.
what's going on, like what's happened to poor Aidan, but anyway, long story short, I went off there, and then I stayed, and the chance came to actually do so. I hadn't really, I mean, I had studied language, but not linguistics, which is
Okay.
quite a different discipline, really. I mean, it's, you can learn a language, or you can speak a language very well, and yet know nothing about the kind of the workings, the mechanics, the structure of it. Whereas you can, I mean, again, maybe this might be a surprise to some of your listeners. A lot of linguists, including very famous linguists like Noam Chomsky, they're not very good at learning other languages.
Okay.
I mean, Chomsky is notorious, or one of the things that's known, about him is that he really only knows English.
Yeah.
No, because people, I suppose there's kind of rambling maybe a bit, and
No.
but I suppose there's two meanings of the word linguist. One is somebody who is good at learning languages, and the other is the kind of more professional
Yeah.
term, which is basically somebody who agonizes and examines minutely
Mm.
the structure of language. And it can be any, like, I suppose one of the kind of claims made by 20th century linguistics, and particularly in the United States, is that all languages are ultimately the same.
Okay.
They may sound different and they look different, and but it depends, but underlyingly they're the same, so that you'd have concepts like subject and object and things like that, that are certain semantic concepts or things like that. No, I mean, how that's actually, manifested will obviously be different, whether it's somebody in Ireland speaking English or somebody in
Mm.
China speaking Chinese. But that would be one of the claims that's made. So I had never studied that aspect of it. I mean, I had studied Irish, I suppose, and I'd studied Latin, but that I hadn't really been exposed that much to other language. I mean, people
Yeah.
often say to me, how many, or people will say, how many languages do you speak? And I say, well, one or two, one and a half. And they're kind of, that's not very impressive. They're kind of,
Yeah.
I think they're a bit, they think I'm a bit of a chancer
Yeah.
because, they expect at least five, and that's not, I mean, I would say, obviously, the more languages the better for linguists,
Mm.
but it doesn't have to be that way. So, I mean, again, if you come back to Chomsky, because he's kind of regarded as the father of a certain branch of linguistics. I mean, in a way, if you look at his early work, he has a sentence: "There is a unicorn in the garden." And he's still 70 years later, he's still examining that sentence
Okay.
in a different theory.
Yeah.
It really is no, I'm simplifying somewhat. He's done
Yeah.
lots of
Yeah.
other stuff as well, but I suppose you don't have to go very far. You can, in a way, one of the great revolutionary things that he and his school put forward was that we can all be linguists if we
Mm.
want, in the sense that you don't have to. Before that, there was very much an emphasis on learning particularly difficult or obscure or old languages like Latin and Greek and Sanskrit,
Mm-hmm.
And he said, no, 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 no. If anybody who speaks a language, which is practically everybody,
Yeah.
can, if you want to, you can kind of look inwards and just look at your own language and the language of the people around you, the society around you, and that's all you need.
Yeah. I always thought of like linguistics as like you mentioned, there's two different types, and I never really thought of it in the sense of that you were learning, you needed to speak five or six languages like you said, like
Yeah.
Chomsky. But the idea was, to me, like the second option that you gave of someone like who's like pawing over words and kind of
Yeah.
really digging down into a certain language, not necessarily, going outside of maybe English or like
Yeah.
Irish or that. So to me, it was always the sense of just someone who's so like it kind of always enraptured in the language that they speak,
Yes.
I
Yeah.
suppose.
That no, that's, and I think too, before you kind of get to the actual formal study and the professionalization and all that, I think very often there are some of us who are, language is fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think that can manifest itself even at an early age. Just as they say, you might be in love with words or the sound of
Mm.
words, or I mean, a lot of it is, for some people, I think it probably comes across as fairly kind of geeky or kind of
Yeah, fair
strange.
enough.
I don't know if you're familiar with the musical My Fair Lady.
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you might remember the main character Henry Higgins, and
Yeah.
he's going around listening to how people speak.
Yeah. That's right.
Some people find kind of slightly disturbing or maybe intrusive or something like that. But I mean, I do find myself I mean, I try not to let it spill over into my personal life. So I try, like some people, for instance, they have a young child, a baby, or learning to speak. They'll be doing recordings of that, and I would have kind of ethical scruples about that. I don't
Right.
be inflicting this on your loved ones,
Yes.
or using them as guinea pigs for your research. I mean, I know,
Yeah.
there is a whole branch of the study of language acquisition among children.
Okay.
And that kind of intersects also with things like speech therapy and so on.
Right.
There's a kind of a practical side to that as well. But I always, sometimes you're at a conference and somebody says, "I know we're going to listen to a recording of my daughter and her first consonants," and
Mm.
could you get somebody else, or, to make up a hypothetical one rather than.
Yeah, yeah, I would side with you on that one for sure. That seems yeah, like a little bit. I wouldn't say inappropriate. That's probably a bit strong, but you know
Yeah.
what I mean. It's like, yeah, it could be done a different way. I found myself going down a kind of a rabbit hole when I was reading your what you've done, and the even some of the words that were in there, and I obviously knew what some of them meant, but not all of them. But when you talk about something like the morphology in language, what what does that actually mean?
Morphology, like a lot of this stuff, it's just a fancy term for something, again, that Chomsky would say we all know, which is how you change the shape of a word depending on the context. So if you take something like to run, okay, and you say, "I am running at the moment. Yesterday I ran.
Hmm.
I would have run a good race." And so the various shapes that the word takes on when you change the sentence, if you like
Right.
this. So it would be, when you learn French or some language at school, the list of the irregular verbs, that
Yeah.
some of the stuff that people find difficult,
Yeah.
You know, the shapes, you know, that you've got to remember to do this or to do that. Like the kind of Baignoire in Irish would be the Shevu and the Aru, if you remember,
Hmm.
you know, at the beginning. So like most European languages, the morphology happens either in the middle of the word, you know, like something like
Right.
foot, feet, that kind of stuff, or you get it in German, or at the end, you know, you add
Right.
on something like, I know, house, houses, right, the is at the end, that kind of thing. But Irish and the other Celtic languages are interesting. They're fascinating in one way, but they're very difficult because a lot of the stuff happens at the beginning of the word.
Right.
No, so
And
you've
yeah.
got cat, but mochat, right, and that kind of thing. That's, you know, and even, I mean, I've taught Irish to non-Irish people from a
Yeah.
different, and people who are pretty, you know, you get. I mean, am I allowed to say, like, the Dutch? The Dutch have quite a high opinion of their ability to learn languages. I think
Oh,
that,
really? Do they?
but they do, yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay. No,
yeah,
that's
they
good
do,
to know.
they do, and or some of them. I don't
Yeah,
want
of
to
course.
generalize. Okay, but very often they, like, Irish stumps them because they're, you know, they're there and they're waiting for the thing to happen at the end of the word and it's happening at the beginning. Anyway,
Okay.
that's all morphology, all that kind of stuff.
You
That
could.
the shape. So, you know, if you think about morphology and the, you know, to morph, to change shape, I mean, I think biologists use it for something else all entirely. I don't even know what it means in science. They use the morphology of
Yeah,
things or something like that, you know. And in language, it's just kind of word shapes would
the
be the.
shape. Not to have a go at the Dutch, but the idea of a certain, people believing that they're better at languages than other, is that just an idea of where they're from? Like there is obviously a few
Yeah,
languages
well,
in.
I think we have to be very careful with statements. So it's like saying an individual is better at
Yeah.
languages than, I think, like, you know, everybody speaks their native language, right? And possibly in some cases might be two languages. But I think what you have to distinguish between is very often, I mean, I think it's a generalization, but it's seen, there is some support for it, that small, what we might call small nations with small languages, which, you know, Dutch, I think there's less than 20 million, which nowadays is a small language.
Yeah.
If you want to live in the modern world, you have to learn other languages because they're not going to learn yours.
Hmm.
Nobody's going to learn Dutch. Nobody's going to learn Icelandic, you know, which is about, I think, fewer than 500,000 speakers.
Yeah.
So if you're from Iceland, you want to travel, you want to go to university abroad, you want to talk to somebody in Australia on the internet, you're going to have to learn English, right?
Mhm.
So I think what you can say is, um, some, you know, nations, groups have to learn another, at least one other language. But I think, you know, people say if you're part of the Anglophone world, which we are, you know, and North America and Australia and England, that we're not good at learning languages. That's not true. It's just we don't have the motivation to learn
Okay.
English because we can get by with English.
Yeah, that's it's
There's nothing. I would be very strong about that kind of determinism because, you know, if, let's say, you or I, that when we were 6 months old, our parents emigrated to, again, I'll just say China because
yeah,
it's
of
so far away, we'd be speaking Chinese
course.
and we'd be learning English probably as a second language, and people would be saying, God, you're very good at your English is very good. You're very good at learning languages.
Yeah,
Whereas because we're not, you know, we don't, I mean, typically most people only learn a language if they have to.
of course. Yeah,
I think that's something that's important. Like, it's this myth of somebody who just, you'll meet these characters who say, "Oh, I just pick up languages," and usually what they mean is, "I can pick up a few phrases," but they don't really go much further than that.
yeah,
You know, we kind of marvel at people's command of English, but, like, everywhere in the world, you know, from even sometimes now from the age of 4 or 5, parents get their children to learn English.
yeah,
So it's not, and very often people don't actually, they might be able to communicate, but they don't reach a very high standard even in English. But very often they don't learn anything else, you know. So,
yeah,
and I think that we'd probably be talking about this with respect to Irish. Like,
yeah,
one of the main factors in language learning is motivation.
yeah.
If you've got to do it, you've got to do it. I mean, I remember when I was in Poland, I knew somebody. She'd have been older, you know. She would have been born maybe in the 1930s, and she she was in the German department, and somebody said, "Oh, your German is very good," and she said, "Well, the reason my German is so good is she grew up in Silesia,
Hmm.
which was incorporated into the Third Reich in 1939, and you didn't have much choice. I
Yeah.
mean, very strong motivation, fear.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And
That's really interesting though, Aidan, because it maybe hasn't been described to me like that before. The idea that just the motivation for us learning the Irish language, and maybe when we get past the school term, we'll say when we're outside of it, because I was mentioning it to you before about there seems to be um, an interest in the episodes where I talk to Irish speakers and about Irish, and the interest is there. But I'm wondering now, is the interest just there because there's a kind of certain romanticism rather than the idea like I really want to learn it?
yeah, well, I think we're getting into very. This is kind of the heart of the matter, really. I think
Mm.
with marriage, it's and I quite honestly, and I'm not trying to avoid like we could spend 100 episodes talking about this and the Irish people, but we won't. We'll try and do it. But at the same time, I'm very kind of wary of overgeneralizing or saying
Yeah,
all Irish people, But so I would ask for a certain indulgence on the part of
yeah.
your listeners, that this is my impression, my experience. But I think I think most people, even no matter what their experience at school was, and very often that was negative, and they might, I have people, you frequently get people saying, God, I wish I'd learned Irish at
Mm.
school, but the reason I didn't was various. And there is there is the problem is, and I hate to be kind of like the bearer of bad news, but learning a language, it's difficult. It's very boring. I did the comparison I often use is like learning a musical instrument.
Yeah.
Most of us probably, I mean, I remember when I was young, I took some piano lessons and I wanted to play the piano, but I didn't because there was more interesting stuff to be done and
Yeah.
I couldn't really stop doing it. And, every so often I say, God, I should go. And it's almost like to get to even a reasonable level, like if like language drills, no matter what the method is, it's kind of boring. It's
Yeah.
like, memorizing those irregular verbs. And okay, there might be, you could do it in the traditional way of writing it out, or you could do it in Duolingo. But in the end, you've got to remember.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole thing. Like, let's say it's a strong living language. You want to go and live in France, and you've done you've reached a certain level, or you might even have a university degree, and then you land in France, and the people you can't understand what they're saying, and that
Mm.
can be very discouraging. Or
Yeah.
people will make fun of you. That does happen because that's human nature, and I
Yeah.
suppose, and sometimes it's understandable, but it's all like you do need to. So, I coming back then to a language like Ireland, which is not widely spoken, there's a whole load of things that, if you like, are stacked against it. What's the motivation?
Mhm.
Okay, I'm Irish, so there's maybe I've got a stronger motivation than somebody who's not Irish, let's say. But then it's kind of, all right, so I learned this, and then what? Where do I go? Because at least, like, if you're learning French, you can go to Paris for the
Yeah.
weekend. And if you stick with it, at least you can read Le Monde, or you can,
Mm.
listen to the radio or watch French films.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
all kinds of, talk to French people on their holidays, all kinds of things. Um, I think that's the big problem if it's not a widely spoken
Mm.
language. Oh, and I suppose what I try to do, and I'm not sure if I'm always successful, is I think a lot of Irish people, they feel bad, they beat themselves up about not speaking Irish.
Yeah.
I mean, this is maybe where I don't want to say it. I mean, it's not mental health, but but it is a kind of a psychological
Yeah.
burden for the Irish nation. I think that you know, and so whether people are negatively disposed or positively disposed, there is this feeling. Why didn't I speak? So you might blame yourself, or you might blame your teacher, or you might blame your society or the
Mm.
government, or all kinds of things. And I like my message would be, stop feeling bad about it.
Mm.
But at the same time, I'd be very clear. Look, if you want to do it, you can do it.
Yeah.
But it's going to take it's like you're not going to learn to play the piano well in a few weeks. And
Yeah.
ultimately, even if you have compulsory music lessons at school, they're not going to do it for you.
No.
Right? You might have a better teacher so on that'll be more inspiring. But in the end, like, it's kind of about you and the piano keyboard, and it's about you. Um, it requires an awful lot of persistence.
Yeah. Of course.
And most people don't, if you're somebody like myself who's fascinated by languages, not just the language in general, but just the individual languages, you probably will have that.
Right.
So it's, and the other thing I'd say too is that, like, anybody who tries to learn a language, it's difficult, and you don't have to be perfect at it either. I mean, I
Mm.
think there are different levels, but I think what people feel is that they should be speaking it perfectly.
Yeah, yeah,
And people don't get to that. Most people won't
yeah.
get to that level, whether it's French or Irish, and not
Well,
to feel too bad.
yeah, it's like, I think when I started playing guitar or something, and I thought like I'd play like some Hendrix, or if
Yeah,
I was going to
yeah,
start playing the piano, or I'd be Rachmaninoff, or the kind of idea that you're going to have to be this level where it's like
yes,
obviously
yeah,
not the case,
yeah.
because like, we can't all be at that level. And the thing I wanted to ask you as well about, because I think as obviously an English speaker, and I notice how the language continues to kind of change, like if you're talking about morphology and things like that, and syntax and stuff, which within the Irish language, is it always changing as well or as much?
Yes, yeah. I think the answer is yes, but it's a bit more complicated
Okay.
because, let's say, if we take let's talk about English just for
Hmm.
a second to start off with. Like, I mean, again, this is one of the things I'm kind of fascinated by. Say if you take my generation and my students, so they'd be roughly, my students would be about 40 years younger than me, so it's nearly two generations. Like, they have different. There's Irish English has changed in that 40 years. If you think
Okay.
so, for instance, I would say house. My students say house. It's what I call the red car roundabout.
Yeah, yeah. We all
Right.
know that one. Yeah.
And again, it's no better. Sorry, again,
Yeah.
without, but, you know, it's in the end, as long as you're understood.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for a house, is that you find the house rather than something else. It doesn't. It's neither. So language is changing all the time.
Mm.
Right? There's no doubt about that. And probably, you have a lot of people, in the last 20, 30 years coming to Ireland, many of whom speak English initially as a second language, and that's going to probably have its effect on the English spoken, say, in big cities and stuff. We
Mm.
don't know. So that's always going on in whatever language we're talking about. And the idea that language is fixed and unchanging, and that this is the only right, that's, I'd be very strong about that. Like, so for instance, you'll hear people saying on the radio, writing letters saying, somebody has bad grammar. I mean,
Mm.
from a linguist with a small L, from our point of view, there's no such thing as right or wrong, right? So if no, from the point of view of schools and society, there is,
Yeah.
right? So there's what they call prescriptivism about language is very, very strong. So it's a delicate one, because if you take something like the double negative in English, right? So we're at school, or the generally accepted form was, I didn't see anything, right?
Yeah.
But in colloquial speech, I didn't see nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lots of languages have double negative. If you're talking about logic or something like that, that probably makes more sense. But and from the point of view of communication, it's fine, right?
Hmm.
If somebody says I didn't see nothing, you know exactly what they
Yeah.
mean. But there's a dilemma, because if two people are going for a job, or a certain kind of job, and one of them says I didn't see anything, and the other says I didn't see nothing,
Mhm.
which of them is going to get the job?
Yeah.
It makes no
Exactly.
sense.
Yeah.
But that's so, you kind of, and on the one hand, you want, if you're a teacher, you're kind of saying, in the eyes of God, it's all the same, we're all equal, but not in the eyes of people.
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry, I'm really going off. So anyway, language is changing, right, all
Hmm.
the time. Now, with Irish, if you look at Irish over the last, say, from, I don't know, the year 1000 to the year 1900, that's 900 years. There's a lot of change happened, like, just like in the history of English. So if you take a speaker, from the year 1000 and the year 1900, they can't understand each
Yeah.
other. But the change is so gradual, we don't, it's like, again, a kind of metaphor I often use is, it's like a river.
Hmm.
It's flowing, but you can't actually, it's very hard to break up the individual bits and say, so, you can't say, at 25 to 5 on the 3rd of May 2024, people stopped saying house and started saying house.
Yeah.
What happened, I don't know when, but over the last 30 years, gradually, you got from one sound to the other. But
Yeah.
there were stages along the way that sometimes you can capture it, sometimes you can't, and sometimes you just have to say this is what happened and we don't know why exactly. So there was loads of change happening in Ireland. Now, after 1900, the change is different simply because you've got a new kind of speaker emerging, the person who doesn't speak Irish as a first language.
Mm-hmm.
So their kind of Irish then was beginning as early as 1900 was very, very different from the native speakers.
Mm-hmm.
As it always is. I mean, if you take, linguists use the term L2, language two speakers, because it's kind of neutral rather than, you don't say good or bad or native speaker or anything like that. It's just a label.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to take, let's say, all the people in Ireland right now who are speaking English as a second language, and you do an analysis, it's going to be very different from the sounds, the structures that you and I are producing. Not better, not worse, but different.
Mm-hmm.
And so what has happened with Irish is that the L2 speakers outnumber the L1 speakers, and to the extent that it's nearly all L2 speakers now.
Yeah.
And they have unwittingly created a different form of Irish.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like nobody, I guess, nobody set out to do that, because what they were doing was they were trying to imitate the native speakers. But that's never going to happen if you have, like, again, if, as I say, and again, it's funny because English is probably the strongest language in the world, and yet it's happening to English as well. If you think of things like the English of African countries or of the Indian subcontinent, I mean, you've got native speakers there whose English is very, very, very different from what we consider, for want of a better word, normally English. What we consider to be right and wrong. So it is happening there, but of course, you have a whole. You've got millions and millions, not billions, of native speakers who kind of, again, unconsciously correct the non-native pronunciation. So again, if you take, let's say you've got two immigrants in Ireland who don't speak English as a first language, they'll have a strong accent and they'll make mistakes and so on, right? But their children will be fully Irish.
Yeah.
And again, I find it's one of the most fascinating things about contemporary Ireland. You somebody who's got a non-Irish name, and yet they're coming out with broad Cork City or broad Dublin City accent. It's lovely. I mean, it's normal.
Yeah.
That's how it should be. So the problem with Irish, coming back to Irish, is that the native the L1 speakers, let's call it that way, who grew up speaking Irish, not learning it really, but just getting it from their parents and the environment, that's kind of almost gone. But you've got a lot of L2 speakers who are increasingly setting the tone, if you like, and they're changing the sounds, they're changing the morphology, they're changing everything.
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent, I often say to my students, if we could bring the spirit of Peg Sayers or something like that back and get them talking to, say, let's say a fluent speaker from a Gael skull, they probably wouldn't be able to understand each other.
Yeah,
and it's not just it's not sorry, it's not just the difference between me and my great grandmother. It's much more radical than that.
Yeah,
I suppose that's the thing. That's the complication, if you like, with Irish and other lesser used languages that you don't get with the big languages.
Where did you when you were writing about the history of the Irish language? Where do you start with something like that? Because it's so broad. Like, you even just mentioned a little bit of it there, kind of go back. It's such a broad subject. I can't even imagine where you began.
Well, I mean, yes, I suppose the only thing about it is you can kind of, I mean, it's like Ireland is much more limited, if you like, than say English, because it's only spoken in Ireland. So so it's bound up with the history of the country. Like, you've got to, I think if you're doing any kind of history, you've got to bring in social and political history as well. So obviously you can't tell the story of Irish without telling the story of English in this country. And that involves, our neighboring island and all the stuff that happened in the last 900 years between the two countries, and maybe is still going on. But that's kind of, I suppose, like in the book I did, I very much was guided by, not exactly century by century, but I started off in the Middle Ages, and then I did, the 16th, 17th century, because that's such a crucial period in the history of this country in terms of language. You've like before 1500, you've got English spoken in County Wexford, cities such as they were and the Pale.
Right.
But like essentially you have an Irish speaking Ireland, right? And then by 1700, only 200 years later, that's changed quite considerably.
Hmm.
So you've got to explain it didn't happen for no reason. There was either because people moved in or the people who were already there changed their land. And so that's like, in a way, I suppose the story of Irish, it's not uplifting in the sense because you're
Yeah.
talking all the time about one language encroaching on the other, and again, this then ties into what we were talking about earlier about the, there's this kind of psychological wound in in Irish society connected with the loss of Irish,
Hmm.
and as I say, even people who don't feel that they regret it, but they, like, let's say people who are defensive about that to me that speaks about some kind of, there's a kind of residual, the guilt that comes from that. I think that shouldn't be there. I
Yeah.
mean, you and I shouldn't be feeling bad because of what happened 200 years ago, but we are in some way. Our society is, and there's all kinds of reasons for that, and um, I don't know what the answer to that is. It's something I often think about, and I just don't. But it's something, you talk to, you, like, if somebody, I meet a stranger in the train or at a dinner party, and what do you do? And you tell them, and they, like, everybody's got an opinion on it.
Of course.
Whereas I think if you're a French teacher, you probably don't get the same reaction.
Yeah. I guess. Yeah.
Even though it's kind of, you could say in one way it's the same job,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
No,
it's
do
not.
you know, because you did mention shame earlier on, and that is a big thing because every so often, the conversation will come. My best friend is from Liverpool, and we talk a lot about the history because they didn't learn that in school about what happened in
Yeah.
Ireland. He
Oh,
wasn't
of course.
taught,
Yeah.
this idea.
Yeah.
So when I'd start telling him about certain aspects of it, he's kind of amazed by it. But I did talk to him a little bit about the Irish language and people not speaking Irish, and I even mentioned, and I never thought this before. Well, maybe I did deep down, but I never said it out loud that I was a little bit ashamed that I didn't speak
Mm.
Irish, and like what you mentioned earlier on, it's not something that I could have necessarily done anything about,
No.
all those
No,
years
you
ago.
couldn't have, because, like, in the end, we're all born. Most of us don't grow up in a multilingual society. You you're born into a certain environment at a certain time, and you get whatever you get from your parents and
Yeah,
society. And that's like, that's, we only have one life.
yeah,
And okay, some of us. I mean, I would say I was lucky enough to be able to study other languages, but that's very special circumstances.
yeah.
You
And
know, I was quite privileged in many ways, in a
are
way
you
that most
still
people
are you
don't.
still as thrilled about like? Are you still as excited about linguistics as you've always been?
I think so. Yeah, yeah,
Really?
yeah. No, I would still. I mean, it's a strange enough kind of way to be, but I like, sometimes somebody says something and I say, "Could you say that again in English?" Or something.
Yeah,
Or, you hear a new word that you weren't aware of, and it could even be something on, like, the radio is great
yeah.
because as soon as a word comes into general use, you're going to hear it on the radio,
Mm.
or you'll hear it from. The other thing is, if you're in education, you'll hear it from your students because they're teenagers and they've got the latest, or your own children or people like
Yeah,
that. And I still find that exciting. I do. I mean, it's um, but I can see at the same time, it's a kind of, it's not an interest shared by, like, I think most people don't reflect much upon language. It's something you use, but
yeah. Maybe
it's,
I I I love reading. I read a lot,
yeah,
and it
yeah.
interests me hugely in the history and all that kind of stuff, everything really. But even when I was like, researching the stuff that you had done, and there was in some of the kind of biography, I suppose there was words there. Like I said, morphology was a kind of word that I could kind of work out what it was, but it still hadn't been written like that to me before. So
Mm.
straight away I have my phone, I'm like, what's morphology? And then like something like syntax, I've heard it so many times and I'm pretty sure I know what it means, but then I'm like digging into it and I'm like, and then you get the kind of the other words that could mean something similar to, and then I'm kind of thinking to myself, am I really into linguistics or is this like
Well, I think you could be,
yeah, could be a new thing for me. And it's I do find that kind of thrilling though, that when somebody says a new word to me that I haven't heard before, and
Yeah.
like I won't go, like, oh, what's that mean? I'll be too self-conscious to kind of too much of an ego maybe to say what does that
Right.
word mean. So I'll go
Yeah,
back
yeah,
and maybe Google it afterwards. But I do
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I like doing that, and I like dropping in every so often. And I think I was wondering this actually about the Irish language in particular, about the cool factor, because
Right,
it's
right.
to me it seems to be becoming more cool, or seen as cool. Like the rap group Kneecap was I know they came out and they were rapping in
Yeah.
Irish, which is, I know it's been done before, but there's a
Yeah,
film
they
made
probably made
about
it
them.
more popular, yeah, or
They
something.
did, and I think there was a film made about it, and they were over in Sundance, or one of those
Yeah.
big festivals. And um, do you think that helps the cause?
I think it probably well, I think it might give people more motivation, coming back to the
Okay.
motivation word again, that, but I mean, I'd have to say, I don't know. I mean, I'm not in touch with, if I don't really, I still see that as it's a kind of a niche area,
Yeah.
likewise, like, and Colleen Q and the film and all that. But
Mhm.
in the end, I think, well, there's two things. Like, we're part of that whole Anglophone world, and
Yeah.
I don't know. I think the coolness is limited. I mean, I think it's, I mean, certainly, if you take maybe something like, I was watching not long ago. There was a documentary about the hothouse flowers, and
Yeah, I watched it.
two
Yeah.
of them where, they sing songs in Irish, and
Yeah.
that kind of is. But I think people then, that's fine. But then if it comes to actually, doing the hard work of learning and changing
Yeah.
it, yeah. And I suppose the other factor that I always mention is, people say, it's a shame that we don't speak Irish, but for most people can just manage with one language, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's just say, kind of like, what if, let's do a what if scenario. Let's say the Irish language revival started about 1890, and let's say it had really taken off and people had gone back to speaking Irish, or started
Mhm.
speaking Irish, whichever. Um, we'd have had, like, it's not just about, getting Irish, but we'd be speaking English as a second language,
Yeah.
and so we wouldn't have, like, think about all the icons of Irishness, like U2, Seamus Heaney, Sinead O'Connor, John McGahern, like all W.B. Yeats, all the people we're proud of
Mhm.
in the world, right? This is who is Ireland, well, we'd be, I suppose we could probably still read Seamus Heaney, but we'd be reading it like as the way we're reading
Yeah.
Irish now, it wouldn't be as accessible.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, and I mean, again, this is maybe it's not fair, but Ireland, if you look at Ireland as a kind of the Irish economy and the Irish society, I mean, we really like being part of that whole globalized.
Yeah.
We like, why does Google have its European headquarters in Dublin? Well, one of the reasons is because we speak English.
Yeah. Exactly.
We like that.
Yeah.
I mean, we're. I think we've got a very mixed. You see, we when we go abroad and people say, "Oh, you're from England," and we say, "No, no, we're not." But of course, like you can't expect your average, Spanish barman to be able to distinguish between bivowels and somebody from
Yeah.
England.
You're
You know
right.
what I mean?
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
far as he's concerned, we're all the same.
No, we get greatly offended by it.
Yeah, and but at the same time, we kind of like when, I don't know, Seamus Heaney wins the Nobel Prize or something like that, and when people recognize, oh yeah, Ireland, you too,
Yeah.
that when you go when in the Irish bar, so it's, and we're kind of, but like, you can't have it both ways.
You can't. Yeah. Like my thoughts on like Kneecap, for example, is that to me it's the sounds, because I can't understand
Mm.
the words. So to me it's the sounds, and I think that's a huge thing in music. You see
Yeah,
acts like
yeah,
you two go to a non-English speaking country and play in the songs, and the people know the words because
yeah,
it's the sounds rather than what the
yeah,
meaning of it,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think like I think you're right. Like I do think it is pretty cool to see that happening. Like a group
Mm.
becoming big in the Irish language, but it's not going to change. It's not going to be a huge shift in how people are going to start wanting to speak Irish so
I
they can
don't. I think
understand Kneecap.
I think there'll always. I think there'll always be kind of a play. Like, actually, one of the things that people. It's funny. I was just reading a book recently about Wales and the Welsh, which is, broadly similar.
Hmm.
And they were saying one of the big problems is, they have this Welsh language TV channel, and it broadcasts more in Welsh than say TG Carr does in Irish, and there's more Welsh speakers and all that.
Hmm.
But the big problem they still have is, teenagers, youth culture that just doesn't. It's not the same watching, or even if there's a reality show in Welsh, they
Yeah.
said, this is not my words, but the author was saying it. They interviewed representative groups of teenagers, and they're saying, well, it's not the same. It's
Yeah.
not cool. It's not cool when it's. I won't mention any names on TG Carr because I'd probably offend somebody, but it's not as X going to different countries and doing silly
Yeah.
stuff is not like it's. You might stand back and say, well, what's the difference between doing this in Irish and in English? But
Yeah.
it's you know
And
it
people aren't going to read subtitles. People have, there's this thing about people have with subtitles that's,
yeah
and I don't quite get it. I remember Bong Joon-ho, the director of Parasite, that time said it in the Oscars. He was like, they're just these
yeah.
little words, and but there is definitely, isn't there? Do you think that the idea of like if something on TG Carr that people will skip over because they don't really want to read the subtitles?
They don't know. I
Yeah,
agree. I think that is true. It's just like I think I don't think we have to worry about the future. I think there'll always be a group of people in Ireland who will make the effort
yeah,
and who feel it's worthwhile.
yeah,
Well, I think that, but in terms of it become like it's not like again, I would come back to people don't change their language unless they have to. And
yeah.
what do they have to? Emigration is the obvious one, or occupation by like the woman I was talking about in Silesia, where you'd be
Hmm.
shot if you didn't speak Dermot. So that's and then I think you could say maybe it wasn't quite as drastic as that in our own history, but there was a lot of that.
Yeah,
Or else you're denied like access to basic services and rights in a certain language. So that's kind of necessity. So there's a lot of that happening in the world, and there always will be.
yeah,
But the idea that a whole society is going to like overnight, if you like, give up one language and take the just for national. And I think that's if you come back to the whole Irish language revival
hmm
movement in the 20th century, the people who were driving that, they were committed, but I think they didn't really. De Valera allegedly said, when I want to know what the Irish people are thinking, I look into my own heart. Maybe not. Maybe
yeah,
that's not what they were thinking back in
yeah,
1937 when the Constitution was drafted. And because even like kind of when the revival was at its height, which would have been before 1920, like most of the people who signed up for the classes, they did it maybe because they wanted to join the IRB, or they were interested in Irish music or dancing. I mean, a lot of them got as far as lesson 5, and then they kind of
yeah,
kicked off. The
yeah, yeah,
usual. Like there were different motives for doing it, but then they just didn't follow through.
yeah.
And I suppose there's the other thing. Like I remember once or twice there was some Irish language event, and I invited my parents to it, and they didn't speak Irish.
Okay.
And I remember feeling like a terrible feeling of awkwardness as well, that I was kind of excluding them from this world.
Yeah.
And I think that comes up a lot as well, that people who don't speak Irish for whatever reason, there is a kind of feeling of, am I a second class citizen? And I
Mm,
think it comes back to that again.
mm,
Like we do have a very complicated linguistic history, and that's a 19th century. There was all this shame about speaking Irish, right? And parents were killing themselves and killing their children to get the children to speak English, right? That's well documented in the
mm.
tally stick and all that. We know all about that. But then later on, there was another layer of shame about not speaking Irish.
Yeah.
And there's that, and then there's kind of resentment and anger, and I don't know again what. Like I do think what we have nowadays is definitely healthier than what we had in the 1920s and 1930s, when there was that really strong compulsory Gaelicization that didn't work in the end.
Yeah. So to flip things around a bit, Aidan, like if when I'm talking about you, like how big of your identity is, within that language? Do you feel that it's a big part of your identity?
I think it is, if only because like I've spent my working life and longer,
Okay.
with it. But at the same time, it's not. I suppose. I mean, I have friends that I only speak Irish to,
Okay.
definitely, and I suppose it'd be odd for us to speak English. So and sometimes you come across it in strange places. I was with a friend last night in a pub here in Cork, and we were speaking Irish, and the barman comes, like a young fella, he was only about 20. He comes out, really good Irish, and
Oh,
he served us in Irish, and we chatted to him for a little bit, which is very nice. That was
yeah, of
lovely.
course.
So you get things like that that would sort of, you kind of say, God, despite everything, there are people still, learning it,
Yeah,
and he was the only, like, there were three or four barmen, and he was the only one who spoke Irish, but I didn't get the sense that the others were making fun of him or resented
yeah,
him. And maybe, I think one thing that has changed again in my lifetime that has helped is we've got so many other languages in Ireland now.
hmm,
When I was growing up, it was English and a bit of Irish.
yeah,
Like, really, you got the odd Spanish tourist or something like that. But whereas now, you could be speaking any language, and
yeah,
nobody's even going to react,
yeah,
because that's just everyday life for everybody in Ireland. And I would see that as a much healthier situation. So if somebody's speaking Irish, that's grand,
yeah,
and so I was saying to myself, God, that's so different from what it would have been when I was 20. The
yeah,
reaction, or the lack of reaction, that was so. There's stuff like that. I mean, I do, I, I'm always thinking about the Irish language,
yeah,
maybe, but again, I suppose the kind of stuff that I'm thinking about might not be. It's hard to kind of sell it to other people, because it is
yeah.
nerdy, it's
Well, yeah, that,
I might wake up in the middle of the night worrying about a certain sound or something like that. I suppose for your average,
yeah, but Aidan, somebody has to do it, you know.
it has to do it. Thank you. That's yes.
Listen, Aidan, we always ask this question as well. What do you like to do in your spare time?
But not anymore. At one stage, I used to do a little bit of running, and I sing in a choir.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a group, actually. There's a place in Cork, the Small Peat Fáideach, and they have a singers club on a Sunday night. And if you can go in there, you can sing anything as long as it's not accompanied. And I sometimes go there singing a song in Irish or English.
That's
That's
harder. That's
actually the
harder.
music is one thing. We didn't mention that really, but
Yeah.
music, like including songs in the Irish language, even the most kind of anti-Irish people they'll have fond memories of a song they did at school or something like
Yeah.
that. There is a kind of a gateway there. So they'd be my hobbies, if you want to put it that way. Yeah.
Do you find when you're singing like unaccompanied, that's a difficult skill.
Yeah, I suppose again I grew up with like when I was growing up there was still a bit of it, even in Cork City, which sometimes
Okay.
surprises people. There would be like, even like, say, certain pubs,
Right.
the people would sing any, various kinds of things, from kind of folk songs to, Frank Sinatra, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but it was something that people did fairly spontaneously. I'm not sure that happens much anymore. It's more like it's kind of got into clubs and places like that, or folk
Yeah.
festivals.
I
You
think
know,
if you broke out into a song without any music in a pub now, it'd be considered maybe like when we talk about in this episode, like people would think that you might have some mental health problems.
or you
Like
might be thrown
literally,
out. You might be thrown out
or you
by
might be thrown out. Like and
yeah,
which is which is a shame, really, because one of my
yeah,
great loves is music, and
yeah.
that idea, like I always see that in films and TV programs, documentaries, things like that, where they talk about the kind of the accessibility of music, like, and
Mm.
it's there all the time. But it's kind of, I don't know if it is there all the time now. Like the idea of someone who was just able to sing and everybody would just stand there and enjoy it.
Yeah, and also, the thing was, you didn't have to be a great singer,
Mm,
but most people had something or other that they could contribute, and it was a kind of a nice way. And that's, well, it has changed. Life
yeah,
is, that's, most pubs too would have music going on. You just couldn't, as you say, you just couldn't do it. Like, it
no,
would be, you'd be, or it's become, it's been put into a certain kind of niche category
yeah,
for tourists or the west of Ireland or something like that. But anyway, there is that singers club, so I like to go to that, and yeah, I mean that's
that's
more or less.
perfect. Aidan, you've been a brilliant guest. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you coming on.
Well, then, thank you for inviting me and letting me talk about this stuff.
No, it was absolutely fascinating. Aidan, if you wouldn't mind sticking with me for a minute, I'll just close it out. I'll get a quick photo of us, and that'll be it.
Yeah, sure. Take your
Perfect.
time.
Um, Also, I have to thank John for doing all the the technical stuff that I'm unwilling and unable or unable, or yeah, both. Thanks very much. As I always thank my mum, my dad, my granddad, Jordan Calvin. My mum will be delighted to have a fellow Corkonian on the podcast
Oh,
again. We're also on, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and then the podcast platforms are Apple, Spotify, Anchor, and Google Podcasts. Obviously, to the people who tuned in today, thank you very much for doing so. And once again, Aidan, thank you so much.
thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next week. Bye.